How's it going, fam? Welcome back to Erica's EDC, and today we are doing a truck talk about edge geometry, edges in general, sharpening, steel, all that good stuff. It is a very rainy day here in New Hampshire, and I can't film inside because the dogs will be annoying. Can't film outside because it is pouring rain. So we're doing a truck talk today, guys. But this is something I've been wanting to film for a couple of days now because this is a really hot topic. And I think I have a little bit of a neutral stance on it. So we're just going to get into the depths of knives, sharpening, all of that stuff. So right now, sharpening is a really, hot topic in the community. We have, Alex Garland and Neves Knives doing lives together and just bouncing off of each other and kind of doing these crazy, extensive, detailed, in-depth videos and content about edges at a microscopic level, taking USB microscopes and looking at edges and bevels and just getting to like the deepest parts of sharpening and stuff like that, and stones and all of this stuff. Check out their channels if that's something that interests you. Alex Garland, I think his channel is called like Outdoor 555, something like that. You probably know him anyway, and everyone knows Jared from Neves Knives. But they are doing like crazy in-depth content on sharpening and edges and all of this stuff. And then, at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, like the bare minimum of sharpening and steel and stuff, you have content creators like, I don't know, Busting Out with D. He uses like a buffing wheel and like a leather belt and just like super old school, and he can still get knives like hair popping sharp with like an old Arkansas stone and a buffing wheel or a leather belt. Do I think those edges on those simple carbon steels done with those really old school techniques, do I think that type of edge is going to last as long as like an Alex or a Jared edge? Absolutely not. But everyone has a place in the community. And I think those old school techniques are just as like entertaining and fun to watch as the, science laboratory stuff. And then you have people right in the middle like me, I would say, Justin from Engineer's Perspective, Pete from Cedric and Ada, Kyle, the scrawny lumberjack, people kind of right in the middle where we have like, I would say, decent sharpening setups. We are trying to dial in freehand sharpening and always learning. We just don't, I don't think any of us have like the time and money to put like 15 grand into 30 sharpening stones. And we don't have like the time because we have families, we have full-time jobs. We don't make I don't make any money off of YouTube, but some of us just don't use YouTube as like a full-time job. So we're kind of right in the middle, right? Like, we can get knives very sharp. We know how to sharpen. We understand how to form an apex, how to deburr, how to do all of that stuff. But we're not like, doing old school leather belts, but we're also not like, we don't have $15,000 worth of sharpening stuff and using like microscopes and like just tearing the entire thing apart down to a science, right? So right in the middle, you've got people like us, and I just kind of want to explain some things that I've learned in hopefully a term that middle tier people understand like me, because it can be really intimidating, right? Like seeing these videos on this side that are so in-depth and so scientific, it can almost be intimidating, and it can almost feel like you're never gonna get good enough. Like you're never gonna be to that level if you don't have all of these supplies and all of the microscopes and all of the everything. And trying 10 different stones per year can be a little, I don't know. It can kind of make you feel inferior in the community. So I wanted to make a video today for people in the middle who just want to have a really good understanding of how knives work and how to sharpen and all of that, but we don't want to be on either, excessive end of the spectrum. So let's talk about geometry first, because everyone has heard the term geometry cuts. And what that is referring to is that is like in the literal sense, geometry cuts. So if we take this knife, for example, which is crazy thin, 7/1000ths of an inch behind the edge, this knife is going to, in theory, cut for longer. I'm not telling you the steel, right? I'm not going to tell you. But this knife, in theory, will cut longer than, let's say, this knife. This SE here, which is 30/1000ths of an inch behind the edge and very thick, okay? Doesn't matter the steel, none of it matters. In theory, this very thin, slicey knife will cut longer than this very thick, beefy knife because there is less resistance going through material with this very thin, flexible knife here. Now, obviously, as you get a little deeper into it, steel choice does matter, but the most important thing in choosing a knife is probably geometry. Because you could take a knife, sorry, they're all lined up on my dashboard here. You could take a knife in a steel like Maximate, which can be chippy in nature. You could take a steel like Maximate, make a very thick pry bar knife out of it like this Essie here, and it shouldn't be as chippy as if you had a knife in Maximate that was only 7th thou BTE. Does that make sense? So like you could make a hard knife in Maximate, but you're gonna have to make it thicker because the composition of the steel lends it to be a little more chippy, right? If you made a knife in Maximate that was only 7th thou BTE, this thing is going to chip on you if you run it hard. You can run it hard with the thick geometry. You cannot run it hard and thin because it'll chip on you. That's just the nature of the steel. But you can almost always combat those issues with geometry, right? So like in my experience, this Native 5 lightweight in Maximate, this thing is probably, 67 HRC. The geometry lends this to actually not be chippy because it's the correct geometry, the correct heat treat, everything kind of lines up. So like this steel has actually treated me very well. Geometry is what cuts. That's kind of like the most important thing. But, the second most important thing is your steel choice. Because then, if we take these two identical knives here, these are made by Kyle at the Scrawny Lumberjack. These knives are actually identical. So this one here is in 10V blade steel at 65 HRC. And this knife here is in 1095 blade steel at 62 HRC. They're both 5 thou behind the edge. They are the same knife. They should have the same cutting performance in terms of moving through material, but the longevity of that edge is, my hypothesis, is that the edge longevity will be given to the 10V because of the composition. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Let me get rid of that. Okay, we're still rolling. So composition does matter after geometry because, like I said, if you have these two identical knives, the composition of the 10V is more impressive. It gives longer edge retention than 1095, and that's just a fact. 1095 is a carbon steel. It's the edge retention is just not up to par with 10V. So, geometry first, but then steel choice, right? And we're going to test this as time goes on, but anyone with a brain is going to have a hypothesis that the 10V is just simply going to cut longer than the 1095 because of its composition, right? And then I guess I would say equally as important is probably degrees per side. So you can take a very thick knife like the Benchmade 940 that has a really thick BTE. It's got to be, I don't know, maybe 25 thou. I don't remember, but thick behind the edge because it's a thick blade stock and it does not have room to thin out really. So it's very thick behind the edge. And this knife does not cut for very long because the angle is so abrupt, and the steel is so thick. You can tell I'm getting excited about it because I'm messing up my words here. The blade stock is so thick that this knife is not going to really cut that long because it's such a thick piece of steel moving through. You could make this knife in S90V that, you know, scientifically has very good edge retention. But if you make it a sharpened pry bar, it's still not going to cut as long, even though it's S90V. It's not going to cut as long as a thinner version because you have more material, more blade stock thickness moving through the material. But what you can do is play with your edge angle. So this knife here, Benchmade typically runs, I think, like 17 to 20 degrees per side. If you lay that edge back to, let's say, 15 degrees per side, you are thinning that edge out. You are providing less resistance, and that blade, even though it is very thick and overbuilt, that blade will actually move through material longer. You are increasing edge retention because you have thinned that edge out. So this particular knife here, this old 940 that I've been using for many, many years, this blade has a 15 degree per side edge that I put on it because I wanted to increase the longevity of the edge, right? So I thinned it out, I laid that edge back, and now this knife, not only does it perform better, but it cuts longer because we are essentially applying that geometry cuts mentality to this knife, right? This knife will never be a thin blade stock like this because it is a thick blade stock. But what we can do is work with what we have. We can thin that edge out, make it a thinner, you know, apex, and it will move through material for longer and better because it's not such an, you know, abrupt angle. Okay, so you're taking kind of the mentality of geometry cuts, applying it to a knife like this, or maybe a Chris Reeve Sebenza, right? We all know that if you take a 940 or a Sebenza and you put 15 degrees per side on it, it is simply going to cut better and longer for the user, right? So it's kind of the same mentality like with Swiss Army knives. These are not really talked about anymore. Nobody cares about Swiss Army knives. I carry one every day. They actually work really well for me in certain situations. I love carrying one. Nobody even knows what steel this is unless you watch the how it's made video, which is actually really cool. But you know, take a Swiss Army knife, right? Or a Mora. It's like this kind of unknown stainless steel. But these knives perform fairly well for the money because the geometry lines up, right? So like this Swiss Army knife, which I don't know if it'll focus, you can see I've used it a lot. I use it a lot. I really beat on it because it's, you know, cheap. It's a beater to me. I use this very, very often. I do not have to sharpen this very much at all. I really don't. I touch it up maybe like once a month, and it's not because the steel is high quality. It's this, you know, kind of a soft, unknown stainless steel. But it is so paper thin. It's such a thin blade stock with a grind that grinds it out so thin that it's more like the geometry is cutting for that time. So the edge itself is not like a razor sharp edge, but I can extend the period of time that I can use this without like touching it up or sharpening it, because the geometry is kind of what's helping me cut for a longer period of time. So this knife is you know, something that I can carry for a month straight and not even touch up because it's so thin. It'll just kind of keep cutting until I actually have time to sharpen it, right? Because it's so thin. So my whole point here is that, like, pick a knife with a geometry that is going to suit your needs. If you want a knife that you do not have to touch up very often, if you're someone who's really busy, or you just don't like sharpening, or it's not enjoyable for you, you just don't want to be bothered by sharpening your knife all the time, you may want to pick a knife where the geometry aligns with what you're looking for as a user, because that is more important than steel choice. Steel choice is very important, and I think it falls second, right behind geometry. But if you want a knife that's going to cut for a pretty long time without needing to be touched up, pick something with the correct geometry. If you like sharpening and you want something that, you know, you're going to have to probably touch up every week, then yeah, pick something thick. Because this is going to have to probably be sharpened very often, because it is so thick behind the edge, you don't have that geometry cutting through the material. You are solely relying on that apex being sharp in a literal sense. You are relying on this knife, on the actual apex to be sharp. Otherwise, this is not going to cut very well because it is so thick. You do not have geometry in your favor with this. So if you want the longest, the longevity, pick something thin. Pick something thin. It's going to move through material even when that literal apex dulls. You're still going to be able to move through material because there is the least resistance with that thickness, okay? And then obviously your second most important thing would be steel choice, because let's take these two, okay? So this knife is in 1095 and this one is in K390. Both very thin, slicey blades, okay? But which one do you think is going to cut longer? They're both thin, they're both slicey, they're both very well made, they both have a great heat treat. Which one do you think is going to cut longer? Well, anyone that knows anything is going to say obviously the K390. Why? Because the composition of the K390 lends it to cut longer than the 1095. We're talking about carbides, we're talking about volume, we're talking about composition, we're talking about hardness, okay? This K390 is probably 65, 66, 67, something like that. This 1095 is probably 61, 62, okay? So even though they're both thin, they're both slicey, they're both a great grind, we all know the K390 is going to cut longer than the 1095 because of the literal composition. So steel choice definitely matters after geometry. And again, it's just, what are you looking for in your user experience? I think people get way too hung up on super steels and steel choice, when in reality geometry is what's going to help you, and that definitely flows into sharpening. I will tell you right now, a thin BTE knife is going to sharpen way faster and with less trouble than something that's 30 thou BTE, even though they say, well, this is meant to be easily sharpened in the field. It's 55 to 57 HRC. It's soft. It's going to be easy to sharpen. No, it's so thick that it's not easier to sharpen, and it's so soft that you tend to get the burr flopping back and forth. And when you have a nice thin knife with a nice thin bevel, it takes a matter of minutes to sharpen because you're not working with as much material there, okay? And that's it. I just want to touch on sharpening real quick too, because like I said, you know, we've got these kind of middle of the road people like me and Pete and Justin who can definitely sharpen a knife. Our techniques may not be Jared and Alex level, but we can get a knife sharp. It's razor sharp. We can get a clean apex. We can get it to cut paper and shave arm hair and whatever you want. Don't get so hung up on sharpening to the point where you discourage yourself and you don't even want to try because you don't think you're going to be as good as these guys. I'll tell you right now, Pete's been posting videos of sharpening every day for like, I want to say at least a week. He's sharpening all types of knives on all types of stones. and he's getting incredible results, and he's doing it within 5 minutes, like super steels, K390 and Maximate, and all of these super steels. He's able to sharpen razor sharp from dull to sharp within 5 minutes with all different types of stones and all of these techniques. And I would say 95% of the people in the comments are super impressed and like, wow, that's awesome, you go. But then you've got those kind of like people that think they're better than everyone, that are like, your technique is wrong, you're bending your wrist, I can see some movement, you don't even know how to freehand sharpen. And it's like, at the end, he literally shows you that the knife is razor sharp. He can even show you under a microscope that the apex is clean, razor sharp. These knives are ready to go. They will serve you well. And people down in the comments, like, you know, it's just like trolls, and there are only 5% of them, but they'll be like, you know, you bent your wrist and you shouldn't show people how to freehand sharpen if you can't keep your arm locked and if you can't get a 100% perfect apex. Don't worry about it, guys. If you use your knives, the whole point of them is that they cut, right? So if the knife can shave arm hair, has a clean apex, and can cut through paper at the end of your sharpening, I think you're okay. You know, we don't have to go nutcase. We don't have to go crazy. Like, if the knife is sharpened correctly and is sharp at the end of your sharpening, I think that's what matters. You do not have to have hundreds of thousands of dollars of sharpening stones. You do not have to have a 25-piece set to get a sharp edge. You can have a 600 grit diamond stone and get your knives razor sharp. End of story. You don't need a lot. You really don't. So I guess what I'm saying is, maybe if you're feeling intimidated by the overlookers of the knife community, watch Pete from Cedric and Ada. Please watch Justin from Engineer's Perspective. They have incredible sharpening videos. I have a sharpening playlist as well. It's literally called Sharpening. But you don't have to be a robot to sharpen a knife and to get it sharp. You just don't. You can get a sharp knife without being cuckoo about it. So maybe check out their channels, because they have some really great content. They really do. And, you know, don't be afraid to play around with geometries and steels and stuff, because even a knife like Maximate, which everyone thinks is chippy, if you get it with the right geometry, like this knife may microchip on a microscopic level, but because of the composition, it will still cut really well for like ever until you sharpen it, because those tiny microscopic chips just turn into micro serrations, and you can cut with Maximate forever. Like, you don't have to be afraid of steels like Maximate, where everyone's like, oh, it's gonna chip on you, it's gonna break. No, and it's not really hard to sharpen either if you have diamond stones. Like, I just use a 600 grit diamond stone on this, and it sharpens incredibly well, really easy, minimal time, minimal effort. Try things out. Try things out. I don't want anyone getting nervous about using certain steels or certain geometries because they're watching these sharpening videos where it's like, holy crap, I'm never going to be able to afford a microscope and afford the $500 worth of Atoma stones and Veneve and strops made out of beaver leather. Twisting up my words here. Just play around with it, guys. That's the whole point of this video. Don't be afraid. Geometry is what's really important, and just practice sharpening on cheap knives, okay? It is really starting to pour here, so I gotta get inside. I love you guys so much. I hope that made sense. Let me know if you have any questions or comments down below. Again, if you want in-depth, crazy scientific sharpening content, check out Jared and Alex. They have great in-depth channels and videos. With that being said, go use your shit. Learn how to sharpen your knives. I'll see you on the next video. I love you so much, fam. Take care.